Hey everyone, this is eCurrency Hodler, and today I want to talk about my project Pod Tags. Now, just for some context, this is something that I did for fun a couple of years ago, and it was just about me trying to figure out how Figma worked, and I just had this idea about how to leave notes inside of a podcast and what that might look like just for myself. And when I heard about the Legends of Lightning hackathon, I was like, oh, why don't I try to repurpose this and just conceptualize what it might look like to create a marketplace with Lightning? And so, yeah, that's what I did. And yeah, just as a disclaimer, I'm not a designer, so if this looks really hacky, it is. It really is hacky. And so, yeah, I want to do two things as I walk through this presentation. The number one thing is to show you some user stories. And so the first user story is really to show you how somebody can save a note inside of the pod tag application. And the second one is how they can list this pod tag for sale on a marketplace built around Lightning. And and the second thing I want to do is just kind of talk about Lightning Address and why I think Lightning Address can really help grow the Lightning Network ecosystem in a really healthy and robust way. Let's talk about pod tags. Pod tags is just a really easy way for somebody to leave a note while they're listening to a podcast. And so let's go through the first user story. And so let's click on my shows right here. And here you'll see a list of all the shows that you subscribe to. And then so let's click into a specific podcast. And then what we can do is let's click onto a specific episode. And here you'll see that the episode has already started playing. And now let's pretend you're listening and you come across a section where you're like, oh man, that was really cool. Or, oh man, that reminded me of this other article that I want to take a note of. Well, you can click the pause button and you'll see that a notepad appears. So you can leave a little note for yourself, you can type it out, you can copy and paste things. You can maybe even leave a little voice memo for yourself of what you saw. And you'll see that there's also a timestamp. In order to save the note, you just swipe down, and you'll see that the note was saved right here, number 4 at the bottom. All right, and so what you also see on this screen is a history of all the other pod tags that you saved for this specific episode as well. And you can tap into a previous pod tag if you want, and you'll see that what you saved previously appears. You can even edit it. And if you type on the timestamp, it'll just jump to the timestamp that you were at. And so you can refresh your memory on what you were listening to when you made this note. And so that's just kind of what I thought I would want instead of a pod tagging app for taking notes. Now, after you save a pod tag, you can go to a pod tag library. And so here you'll see a list of pod tags that I saved for a variety of different podcasts. So there's the Unchained podcast, What Bitcoin Did, Stephen Livera. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here is something called other pod tags. So let's go through this second user flow. The second user flow is a marketplace for pod tag notes. And so here you'll see the most recent pod tags that are being listed for sale, and you see different categories. You have a table of contents, metapods, and transcripts. Table of contents is basically timestamps of various topics inside of an episode. If an episode is 2-3 hours long, sometimes I may not want to listen to everything, and so I want to skip to the most relevant part of a conversation, right? And so metapods are just commentaries of podcasts. And so maybe you go through a podcast and you're like, oh man, I have these thoughts around this. I'm an expert in mining, and I just heard a mining podcast. Well, here's the real story, or here's the real facts around this podcast. So I can sell that. And then there's transcripts. This is a business that exists today. A lot of people get paid to write transcripts for podcasts, and so maybe somebody else can do that inside my app. And so let's go through a user flow of how somebody can list a pod tag for sale. So we go into a pod tag for a specific episode, and then I can click list my tag. And so when I click that, it grabs all the pod tags for the specific episode and lists that for one episode. So I click that, and you'll see that there's an amount. So type in however much you want to sell it for, a category. It can be a table of contents, Metapod, or a transcript, or maybe another category that you think of. And then enter a description. Sell your pod tag to people who might be interested in buying one. After you fill all this out, you'll click list pod tags, and then it'll immediately appear in the marketplace for pod tags, right? So now let's switch context. I'm a user. I'm scrolling through the podcasts, through the pod tag marketplace, and I see that this podcast has someone selling a pod tag for this podcast, and the episode title is How Bitcoin Helps Mitigate Climate Change, and then there's a description, there's the listed category, and there's an amount. There's an amount of how much that person is selling this pod tag. So in order to buy it, I just tap on the pod tag that's listed, and immediately a Lightning invoice appears. And I can just grab my Lightning app, pay the invoice, and then the pod tag will appear in my pod tag library. One question that you might have is, well, where is this Lightning invoice coming from? Well, it is not coming from me as the app developer. I am not generating this invoice. This invoice is actually coming from something called a Lightning address, and the Lightning address gets pulled inside the profile of the seller's profile inside my app. And so where's that? So if you click on profile on the bottom right, you'll see that there's a name, there's an email, and then there's a Lightning address right here. Okay, and so if you're not familiar with what a Lightning address is, it's kind of like an email. It kind of looks like eCurrencyHodler@protonmail.com or something like that, but it's at zbd.gg. Yeah, a Lightning address is basically a really easy way for somebody to receive Lightning payments, right? The beautiful thing about Lightning address is that it is a open source standard that many Lightning wallets actually have integrated into their wallet software. And so you can type this eCurrencyHodler@zbd.gg into a Lightning wallet right now, and you can actually send it some sats. And so the other nice thing about Lightning addresses is that it's really easy to set up. And what I mean by that is that several companies make it really easy for somebody to create and claim a Lightning address. The downside of this, though, is that if you create a Lightning address through a company, it's custodial, right? And so if I created a Lightning address through Zebedee, I don't actually have access. I don't have access to the funds inside that Lightning address. Zebedee does, but it's really easy to withdraw. Now, the advantages of a Lightning address is that it's just super easy to integrate inside the app, and it's super, as an app developer and as a user, it's super easy to get. It just takes a couple of seconds to generate a Lightning address in Zebedee or Bitrefill, and then I can just copy and paste that into my profile, and bam, I'm done. I can immediately start receiving Lightning payments inside my app for this pod tag marketplace, which I think is pretty cool. Oh, and one more thing, back to the invoice. Just kind of want to talk about the technical, what's going on in the back end and how this is getting created. When someone lists a pod tag for sale, this information about the amount, category, description gets stored in my server. And when somebody taps on the pod tag to purchase it, an API call gets made to the Lightning address with the invoice amount, the description, and then the invoice gets served inside my app to the buyer. And so it requires very little work for me to show this to my end user. I don't have to build business logic around this. I can just leverage Lightning address, which is pretty awesome, pretty efficient for me as an app developer. Okay, cool. So let's talk about some revenue models for pod tags. One I thought, is pretty simple. It's an app store subscription model. The first 50 personal pod tags are free. You can get up to 100 for $30 every 6 months, 500 for $60 every 6 months. And if you're paying 120, you get unlimited pod tags. And maybe even having a paid subscription gives you the ability to export and import pod tags. And then now let's talk about the marketplace. The marketplace leverages Lightning. And so I'm thinking in the beginning, it's free. It's free as people list pod tags. And later on, in my dream world, let's say that there's millions of users that are listing their pod tags and tons of volume of people selling their pod tags. Well, at that point, maybe I take a 10% fee. I just wanted to briefly talk about Lightning and why I chose Lightning for my marketplace. Well, this allows me to list pod tags for super cheap, or it can allow anybody, any seller, to list them for really cheap because I don't have to factor in credit card or app store fees. Going back to my subscription model, the reason why you don't see $5 a month for up to 100 pod tags is because of credit card fees and app store fees. If I list something for $5, I might only see like $1 back. And so at that point, like, what's even the point? And so, by having the marketplace built on Lightning, I can people can sell their pod tags for super cheap for 10,000 sats, less than a cent, and then anyone in the world can sell a pod tag because you don't need a bank account. As long as they have a smartphone, they can download this app, they can create a pod tag and sell it. And so now let's talk about why Lightning address. I think Lightning addresses are really great because self-hosted Lightning node is just too high a barrier for an app developer or seller. All right, let's say I try to develop an app like this, right, in the future. I don't really want to run or manage my own Lightning node. I don't want to spend the time trying to figure that out. I want something I can plug into easily, something that already has business logic built into it. That's what Lightning address is. On top of that, for users, it's super easy to set up. It just takes a couple of seconds. You log into Zebedee and you're automatically given a Lightning address. You can just copy and paste that into my app and boom, you're done. You're ready to go. As an app developer, I also don't have to build a Lightning wallet UI inside of my app. Maybe I do include transaction history. Maybe I do include a generalized balance for the wallet, but I don't have to think about send and receive. I don't have to think about building all that out. I also don't have to manage liquidity for the Lightning node. I don't have to worry about finding the right channels or anything like that. That's somebody else's job. And like I mentioned before, it's just super easy to add a Lightning address to your profile. So when we think about scaling the Lightning network to the mass market, I think it's kind of hard right now to expect the average user to run a self-hosted Lightning node. It's too difficult. And so in order to just decrease that barrier to entry for both app developers and users, I think it just makes a lot of sense to leverage something like Lightning address, where it just takes a couple of seconds for somebody to set up. And what I want to highlight here is that the more applications build on top of Lightning address, it increases volume and transaction activity for liquidity service providers for the Lightning network. And by doing that, you're inherently creating more transactions, more routing, and you're creating a more robust network overall. And so now you have a pretty darn good business model as an LSP because you have all these different apps leveraging the Lightning addresses, and you are the one routing and handling all of it for them. And it makes sense. It makes sense for somebody else to manage the liquidity. It makes someone else to manage the channels and the UI behind it. Let me, as an app developer, just focus on my app. Yeah, that kind of wraps up my presentation. Hopefully, you found that somewhat helpful and useful. Thanks for entertaining my idea around pod tags and how I could theoretically conceptualize building a marketplace on top of Lightning.